Chapter 11, Lecture 3 is going to start talking about national parks and kind of lead up into a case study on gray wolves and how they've affected Yellowstone National Park, and then kind of some ideas at the end of how we can preserve these pristine environments. National parks, absolutely gorgeous. If you've never been to some, go Yellowstone National Park, for example, Glacier National Park, and many other ones, lots out west, lots in Alaska, all over the place. They've been established by governments, their land set aside. Do need some help, unfortunately. We do get logging, mining, and some poachers, unfortunately, involved in these areas. A lot of times, as we allow more people in, we also expand the corridor for more non-native species to invade or get moved in unintentionally. The reality is with national parks, people really like to go to them, but there's too many cars. We have too many off-road vehicles, and visitors, of course, expect very urban facilities, and a lot of times it's something simple as putting up a tent and camping. Rangers do spend a lot of time on law enforcement. Unfortunately, they went to college, of course, to promote conservation in these environments, but a lot of times they have to deal with the people instead of doing it. A really interesting case study is with the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone. Back in the 1800s, of course, we had people moving out west. They cut down a lot of trees. They started slashing and burning, growing crops, and another thing they did was raised things like cows. Well, what happened is the wolf population is a natural predator to cows, so they took a lot out, so ranchers got quite mad, and they basically eradicated them. And then what happened is we saw a lot of fallout from it. Keeping in mind, wolves are a keystone species. They eat bison, elk, caribou, deer, coyotes. They keep their population in check. What started happening was without the gray wolves, we didn't have things like elk. Well, elk eat things like aspen and willow trees. So then what happened is we didn't have aspen and willow trees. The elk population was so huge, they were eating all of them. As in the 90s, what happens is we started reintroducing wolves back to Yellowstone National Park, and the checks and balances have really recovered since then, and actually aspen and willow trees have reestablished. So a couple of things about national parks. The idea is maybe integrate some plans for managing the parks nearby federal lands, add new parkland near threatened parks. So if there's threatened parks, why don't we just protect the area around it to try to help it out? Buy private land inside the parks, locate visitor parking, it should say, outside parks, and use shuttle buses to go in so we don't get that beat down trails and things like that by all the tourists. Increase funds for park maintenance and repairs. Unfortunately, that's going in the opposite direction these days. Survey wildlife in parks, raise entry fees, put those funds for park management and maintenance. Limit number of visitors to crowded park to help the park rangers. Increase number of number and pay of park rangers. Encourage volunteers to give visitor lecture and tours. Encourage volunteers to give visitor lecture and tours, and seek private donations. A couple of options. Unfortunately, national parks aren't really well funded. We do have things called nature reserves, and it's the idea of a conservation approach. We want to protect at least 20% of the Earth's global systems, which is really low, actually. It should be higher than that. In 1950, when we set up the first Nature Conservancy, these are large private natural systems in 30 countries. So they're private lands that are protected, and you really can't do anything with them. And being private, of course, you can control who comes on them and off of them much easier. In 1964, we had the Wilderness Act, which is significant. 4.6% of the land was protected in the United States. Now it's wilderness. Wilderness means you can't do any logging or mining or anything like that. A mere 4%, 4.6% really, unfortunately. Here are some very strong protected areas. These are regions outside the United States, of course. You can see in Costa Rica, which we'll do a case study on soon. Costa Rica is a very up-and-coming ecotourism area, but these are all protected, solely protected lands here that these countries are not allowing other interests like logging and ranching and mining and things like that. They're protecting these areas, which is smart. Costa Rica, as an example, has consolidated its land and natural resources into 8 what's called mega reserves. And they've really promoted, as you can see in the picture there, things like zip lining and ecotourism. They are finding that they can actually make a lot more money off of ecotourism than they would allowing things like lumber. or preserving rather. We have things called habitat corridors. A corridor, think about like a hallway as a corridor. What happens is you can see the picture of the corridor. We actually have a corridor around here. The Horicon Marsh is a corridor where we have a lot of species that migrate and breed in that region. So these corridors support species that allow migration. They can threaten isolated populations by allowing pest species, disease, and fire and invasives, which isn't a great thing. And it could be costly to acquire and protect and maintain. But overall, as you can see like in this picture down in the bottom here, this is a corridor right here which is protected, which happens to be along a river system. This is out east. And what happens is this is all protected land. This cannot be disturbed at all, which is great because we know there's a lot of species that probably migrate through there, probably breed in there and raise their young in there, so we're protecting those corridors. A biosphere reserve, another idea used for sustained extraction of resources like food and fuel. Back in 1971, we had UNESCO, which is the UN ESCO, or CSO, created what's called the Man in the Biosphere Program. The idea is, as you can see in the picture to the right, we have what's a core area that's protected from all areas or human activity. So these are protected areas where we have a core, can't do anything in them. Nature just does as nature does, and we leave it alone. Then we have what's called a buffer region. So you could actually have these in cities too. You have a buffer region which is a little less protected, and then we have another buffer out here which is used by local people. So we kind of protect it. This is an excellent idea. We get a little bit of everything. We can allow people to live there, plus we get preserved areas on the inside. So that's a biosphere reserve areas. Ecosystem management in general integrates ecological, economic, and social principles to keep diversity of the reserves. We combine private organizations, scientists, business, and things like that in order to maintain systems. The wilderness idea, remember, the wilderness is protected. An area should be at least 1,500 square miles. Shouldn't be affected by air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution. So we are keeping everything pristine in this wilderness. And remember, once we allow logging roads into an area cannot be deemed a federally protected wilderness anymore. So the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964 by the United States. Again, only 4.6% of the land is protected, most of that in Alaska. The Bush administration unfortunately stopped protection of areas underneath the Wilderness Conservation Act, it should say. So unfortunately, we're seeing more things like mining and drilling in those regions. Ecological restoration, so basically fixing what's broke. We're restoring wetlands now, we're replanting forests, we're reintroducing native species. We're removing non-native species, we're removing dams, which we'll talk about down the road, but these are really good things to prevent, or to basically take back our environment. We're rehabilitating, trying to restore ecosystems to a functional state. We're remediating, which involves cleaning up of chemical contaminants. So an area that in this region is down in Milwaukee by the Potawatomi area, just by Marquette. That area is very polluted because of factories back in the day. So let's remediate that. Let's clean it up and try to get that restored. We replace things, replacing a degraded ecosystem with a productive pasture or tree farm. So if something's bad, let's replace it with something that can. These are all protected areas, or actually hot spots in the United States and around the world. If you take a look at California right here, those are deemed hotspots because we have so much pressure from people living there pushing out native species. And that's something that we need to. So ecologically restoring, what we need to do is mimic nature. Let nature do as it needs to do and everything will be fine. We just influence them way too much. We need to recreate ecological niches, rely on pioneer species to reestablish, control non-native species, and reconnect small patches of forest to restore larger ones. Think about around here, we have that nasty garlic mustard that's growing everywhere. What that does is it pushes out native species. We need to get rid of that. We need to let the native species grow and flourish. So we a lot of times have, in parks around here particularly, have garlic mustard pull days where we pull all of that stuff out and destroy it. We need to prevent ecological damage. It's much cheaper than restoring it in the first place, so it's much comes into play with the precaution. So what can we do? Good old Edward O. Wilson. Preserve the world's hotspots. Hotspots are areas where we have a lot of people and they're generally pushing out or causing incredibly huge extinction rates in areas. California is an example of one. Hawaii is another example of a hotspot. We need to keep frontier forest intact, it should say. We need to cease logging in old growth forests. We need to let old growth forests just do as they do, go through secondary succession. That's a natural process. We need to identify marine hotspots. Marine hotspots are areas that are causing premature extinction in a lot of regions, such as coral reefs. Protect world's lakes and rivers. We need to map the world's biodiversity. We need to assure the world's terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity is preserved. And we need bottom-up political pressure from citizens groups, even things such as the Sierra Club, putting pressure on our government agencies to try to protect this stuff. All right, that's it for Chapter 11.